My name is George, and I am currently 45 years old. What I am about to tell you happened years ago. For decades, I couldn't bring myself to share this with anyone, not until I was locked away inside this asylum room where my mind is, trapped behind bars, and they look at me as a pathetic wretch who has lost his sanity. Dr. Frank, these pages in my hands, written with old, dried ink, are not the delusions of a madman. They are the final outcries of a soul permanently lost between the railway tracks. It all began in the suffocating and bleak September of 2014. At the time, I was working as a senior track inspector for the railway company. I had been assigned to a remote, ancient town called Bristol, hidden away in the most secluded corner of the countryside, a place that could barely find a spot on any map. The town spread across the floor of a valley, permanently shadowed by steep, jagged mountains and towering, skeletal pine trees. My objective was to inspect the historic, long-abandoned Manchester train station and its surrounding track line, which had been completely deserted since the 1950s and was whispered by locals to be cursed. I was to prepare a technical report on whether the entire line could finally be dismantled. The very first day I arrived in town, the leaden, heavy clouds completely blanketing the sky cast a dark shroud over my spirit. Every time I mentioned the name of the station, the townspeople would avert their gaze, offering coded, fearful warnings to stay Hawaii. An old man who ran the local inn, leaning heavily on his cane, had told me, "Son, that place belongs to passengers who never reach their destination, not to the living. Don't go there. Just tell your superiors that the tracks have rotted away and let it go." But I was a man raised on rational science and structural engineering. I didn't have the luxury to indulge in provincial superstitions. Early the next morning, I packed my rucksack and set out toward the Western Valley, where the station was located. The trail was nearly choked out by dense, wild vegetation and overgrown weeds. After a grueling 2-hour trek, I saw the rusted iron rails break through the soil like rising serpents, stretching toward the site. There it stood, in all its former grandeur, but utterly collapsed. The Manchester train station. The station building was a massive structure constructed of hand-cut stone. Its arched windows shattered, and a portion of its roof completely caved in. Overgrown ivy clung to the walls, making the entire building look like a grand sarcophagus being slowly swallowed by nature. The moment I stepped inside, the first thing that hit my senses was a pungent wave of ancient soot, rotting wood, and the suffocating chemical stench of decades-old machine oil. The wooden benches in the waiting hall were smashed. 2 splinters, and the cast iron bars of the ticket booth were caked in deep rust. On the floor, half buried in the dirt, I spotted an old station master's cap. When I picked it up, a strange black residue of soot flaked off from underneath it. The air inside the building was easily 10 degrees colder than the outdoors. As my breath plumed into white vapor in front of me, a deep sense of wrongness began to take root in my chest. I wanted to finish my job as quickly as possible and get far away from this place. Pulling my notebook from my pocket, I jotted down my opening observations. Manchester Station. Load-bearing stone columns remain structurally sound, but timber elements are completely rotted. Line has been inoperable for a considerable duration. Around 3 in the afternoon, I stepped into the old station master's office. It was a room where time had completely frozen. A massive, rusted Castillon stove stood cold in the corner. On the desk, covered beneath a thick layer of undisturbed dust, sat a telegraph machine and an old logbook. I carefully turned the brittle pages, noting that the final entry was dated November 14th, 1956. As the entries progressed toward the end, the handwriting became increasingly distorted, degrading into a frantic, trembling scroll. On the very last page, only a single sentence was written. The night train came again, But this time, they didn't come along the rails. They came from beneath the earth. Prayers are no longer enough to protect us. We have no choice but to open the door. The sentence sent a violent shiver down my spine. Just as I was about to close the logbook and pack it away, the heavy stench of old machine oil in the room was suddenly overpowered by a nauseating wave of burning flesh and sulfur. Immediately after, a sound shattered the quiet from the platform outside. It was a sharp, screeching, ear-piercing noise, the sound of rusted iron grinding brutally against iron. It sounded as though a massive train, coming from somewhere incredibly distant, was slowing down and pulling into the station. My rational mind screamed that this was physically impossible. This line had been disconnected from the main railway miles away, and the tracks were entirely missing in sections. I bolted to the window. Outside, a dense fog had cascaded down from the upper ridges of the valley like an avalanche, completely engulfing the platform. You couldn't see a foot in front of you. Yet, my ears were not deceiving me. The rhythmic, heavy hiss of a steam locomotive's pistons and the metallic clatter of iron wheels on the tracks came to a dead stop right in front. Then came a massive, pressurized release of steam, FSSs. Straining my eyes through the window, a dark silhouette materialized inside the fog. It was a man dressed in archaic, pitch-black railway attire. In his hand, he held a gas lantern. The flame inside glowed with a sickly, greenish, malevolent light. The man's movements were mechanical, stiff, and agonizingly slow. He began to walk toward the station building. "Who's out there?" I yelled through the glass. My voice echoed sharply across the empty valley, but the figure didn't even flinch. I broke out of the office, ran down the corridor, and threw open the large wooden door leading to the platform. A freezing wind slammed into my face. The platform was completely empty. There was no train, and there was no man with a green lantern. There was only a fresh, black puddle of oil glistening on top of the rotted tracks. And right beside that stain, pressed into the mud, were wide, flat footprints that looked human, yet completely lacked any toe prints. The tracks of the feet led straight toward a rusted iron hatch that opened into the old cellar beneath the station. The sky darkened rapidly as the sun dipped behind the mountains and abandoned the valley to a pitch-black night. It was far too late to attempt a return to the town. Finding the narrow trail in this complete darkness and suffocating fog would be impossible. I decided to barricade myself in the station master's office and wait for dawn. I pushed a heavy wooden cabinet against the door to brace it and tightly secured the windows. The cyclopic beam of my flashlight could barely cut through the oppressive dark pooling in the corners of the room. I tossed a few scraps of old wood I found into the stove and lit them. The dancing, unstable light of the fire cast massive, distorted shadows that seemed to play across the walls. Tea moment. The clock struck midnight. The temperature inside the room plummeted like a knife blade. The fire in the stove vanished within seconds, completely snuffed out as if an invisible block of ice had been dropped over it. Total darkness swallowed the room. Right then, a sound began to echo from deep beneath the floorboards from the cellar where that rusted iron hatch lay. Thump, thump. Thump. Someone or something was rhythmically striking the wooden floor from below. Then, the whispering started. It didn't belong to a single person. It sounded like hundreds of voices murmuring simultaneously in an incomprehensible, rhythmic cadence. The sounds bled through the cracks in the masonry, oozing out of the walls. I slammed my hands over my ears. But the whispers vibrated dead center inside my skull. It possessed the cadence of an ancient mourning dirge from the depths of Anatolia, but the words were entirely non-human, resembling the guttural rasps of creatures whose tongues could not form human speech. Suddenly, a violent blow struck the platform door. The heavy cabinet bracing it began to tremble. The sound from the outside didn't sound like a human fist hitting wood. It felt like heavy masses of formless flesh and boneless limbs slamming against the barrier. "Open the door, Inspector." A muffled, subterranean voice echoed. It didn't sound like Arthur or the innkeeper who had warned me earlier. This voice was a dead rasp seeping through rotting coffins deep beneath the soil. "The train is departing. Your ticket has already been punched." Terror choked the breath right out of my throat. Suddenly, the old telegraph machine on the desk began to click frantically on its own. The paper ribbon was feeding out of the machine at a violent speed. With trembling hands, I aimed my flashlight at the device. There were no letters stamped onto the paper strip. Instead, there were only straight lines composed of dried, dark blood, looking as though they had been gouged into the paper by sharp fingernails. As the ribbon grew longer, the blood began to drip off the desk and onto the floor. Drip! Drip. I couldn't take it anymore. My sanity was fracturing. I forcefully pried open the rear window and threw myself out, landing hard on the muddy earth of the platform. The fog was so thick now that I couldn't even see my own hands. But the space around me wasn't empty. I could feel it with every fiber of my being. The air was thick with the overpowering stench of sulfur and burning. The fog shifted violently, and every single old gas lamp lining the platform flared to life, burning with a brilliant, ghostly green light. As the light washed over the station, the sheer horror of my situation was laid bare. The platform was packed with hundreds of things. It was impossible to call them human. They were all draped in attire from a century ago, but their faces were entirely seamless. They had no eyes, no noses, and no mouths. They possessed nothing but pale, featureless skin that looked as though it had been molded from dead wax. The legs of some were bent completely backward at the knees, causing them to drag themselves across the rails in a grotesque, unnatural crawl. In the dead center of the platform stood the man with the green lantern. He slowly rotated his body to face me, right in the Bajo Araro, middle of his blank face. The skin suddenly split open into a vertical tear, revealing rows of razor-sharp, pitch-black teeth. We waited for the one who would never arrive, and we took the soul of the one who did. He bellowed at that exact moment. Every single faceless creature tilted their blank heads toward the sky and unleashed a piercing, non-human shriek. Black, tar-like fluid began to erupt from the spaces between the tracks. The earth beneath my feet shuddered violently. The stone walls of the station cracked open, and from the rupturing masonry, old skeletal remains, bound tightly with ancient amulets, came spilling out. This station was never just a railway stop. It was a grand seal, a subterranean prison built to lock away an ancient, malevolent army of Djinns beneath the earth. And my arrival, digging through old records, had loosened the binding. I tried to turn and run, but my boots weren't stuck in mud. They were sunk deep into the black tar, oozing between the rails. As the creatures closed in on me, one of them a figure draped in a tattered wedding dress, though nothing but a rotting skull was visible beneath her veil, wrapped her ice-cold hands tightly around my neck. In that final pocket of consciousness, the last image burned into my mind was the man with the green lantern, stepping down toward me with his backward bent legs, his voice whispering directly into my ear. "We are here every single night, Frank. You are a part of this station now." The next morning, the local villagers found me lying between the tracks, semi-conscious and completely stripped of my sanity. There wasn't a single physical wound on my body, but my hair had turned completely snow white in a single night. Tay locked me away here, in this asylum. Doctor, you tell me that I am the only one who hears those grinding iron wheels and those frantic whispers behind the walls. You force me to take antipsychotic medications, but all of you are wrong. Look closely at the desk in front of you. Look at that small object I left right beneath this letter, the thing that found its way into my pocket on the platform that night is a rusted, ancient train ticket. It bears today's exact date and my own name written clearly in dried blood. And on the back of the ticket, the black smudge of a backward-facing footprint is still fresh, reeking heavily of sulfur.